Pleasure to talk to you today, Adam. We spoke at this year's TIFF following the awards. I came up to you and I talked to you about how much I love this particular movie.
Oh, cool. Great.
So it's great to get a chance to talk to you.
Great. Thank
Um, Seven Veils was a last minute addition to my TIFF slate back in 2023, and it ended up in my top five of the entire festival.
you.
So
Great.
I'm really excited for the general public to finally get a chance to see it.
Yeah, finally.
Uh, exactly, right?
Yeah.
And my first question is, you've directed quite a few operas before, including Salome. What are the differences in directing a film based within the opera and directing the opera itself?
They're completely different processes. So like the thing that happened here because it was a remount is that I we put it on its feet s- so it was ready to be presented on stage. And so that's a very when you're directing for the stage, you have to make sure that the actors understand it in a way that they can do it again and again over a period of time, so that the the type of directing is different because you know that the singer's going to ultimately take it on their own and interpret it the way they want within a certain parameter. With film directing, you are just looking for that moment. You're looking for that. It's very spontaneous, and the actor never has to do it again. It's just has to be generated and has to feel real at that moment. So it's quite. I mean, there's a very good moment in the film where she's giving a direction, a stage direction about what someone is supposed to be feeling in response to a line, and you can see what Amanda is doing, which is really spontaneous, and she asks at that point for the singer to repeat something so the other singer can just hear what that sounds like. And there's something rehearsed about what the singer is doing because, in fact, it is rehearsed. He's done that a lot of times. But you look at Amanda's reaction, and it's so spontaneous. And, she only had to react that way that one time. The camera was there and it's embedded. So it's very different in terms of what I'm expecting and trying to generate from the actors, um, in in terms of my job, right? And that was fascinating. It's a good question because I've never really had to deal with that question of what my job description is, um, uh, because it is a different switch that you're turning on when you're directing for stage, um, especially with opera, because there's also considerations of what the singer needs to be able to do in order to sing, in order to be able to produce that sound. They can't just be doing anything with their body. There's certain things that um, are no-go zones, which doesn't apply when you're doing film acting.
No, that totally makes sense. And you brought up Amanda, so let's talk about her a little bit. I think she's great in this film, but I'm curious what the casting process in selecting her was when you have a largely Canadian cast surrounding her, and she is obviously not a Canadian actress.
Well, it's really just a promise we made to each other 15 years ago, when we did Chloe, that we would find something else. Like we had such a great experience with that character in that film, and I I had auditioned her for that role because it was right before she broke. It was around the time of Mamma Mia, I guess, and so I was looking at a lot of young actresses for that role, but the moment she came into the room, it's like, oh, this is an exceptional talent, and so I was happy to be able to work with her on Chloe, but we always had the idea of doing something else, and over the years there were a number of projects that I thought might work, and but but then this came up, and I at the moment I started writing Janine, I really felt this was for her, and I was just praying that she would be available because we had no flexibility. That's a hard thing to kind of now look back at. Like we had to shoot it while the opera was on stage. So that's an incredible restriction, right? Like normally you have some wiggle room and you're able to, move things around according to schedules, but we couldn't. It had to be shot literally 2 years ago. Like this was on stage, in February of 23. So yeah, 2 years ago we were just praying it was all going to come together.
Well, it did come together, so you
Yeah,
can definitely
yeah.
feel
I mean,
good about
you know,
that.
I just feel like it was a huge risk, and I'm so thankful for to my producing partners because it had pressures on it like no other film I've ever made. Just because, um, you know, you're working with really specific schedules, and the singers, who are also in the film, have their own schedule, and they can't be shooting all day and then singing at night. So we had to be really, aware of that. And there were specific times we could be in the building, because I won't get into the details, but it was a number of moving parts, and so that it all came together was a miracle, and I'm really thankful.
Yeah, and I think the reason it works so well is a lot of the themes that it works within. It's not just a film about the opera; it's a film about dealing with trauma. A large part of it is about dealing with trauma. Now, with as we watch Janine work through her trauma, she makes some, let's say, questionable boundary related decisions with some of her the way
Yeah,
she speaks with her cast and things like that. How do you think the skeleton of this film would change if the gender roles were reversed and we had
yeah,
Seyfried's directing character as a male, and also
yeah,
we had the prop
yeah,
thing flipped as well?
yeah. That's a great question, and I think it would be immediately unacceptable, like the lines that she blurs, because look, she is. Look, a couple of things. First of all, just to make clear, you don't need, like, we're talking about it as an opera uh, film, but it's not really. You don't need to know anything about opera going into this film. You don't need to know specifically about Salome. You don't need to know, like, it's the opera house as a working environment. So it's, we're seeing, people mounting an opera, but again, it's very easy to enter in this if you don't know anything about opera at all. But that being said, it is an opera that's dealing with an extreme act, like a really violent act. It's an act that a lot of people know about. Salome dances the seven veils and then demands the head of John the Baptist that she then kisses, like crazy, crazy act. And so I wanted, since that's obviously bad behavior on the part of Salome, to say the least. But there's a lot of bad behavior in the history of why she did that, and so the film is exploring that. Certainly, this production explores that in terms of her background, her relationship to her stepfather, and the idea of trauma comes in. And so in most films about trauma, the trauma is kind of like held back and it kind of bubbles to the surface in a series of, like, the character comes to terms with it. In this case, and this is what makes, I think, Amanda's role so distinctive, the character understands, like what the trauma is. Everyone knows about what happened, with her mentor who originally did the production. Everyone knows that, he was taking ideas from what happened between her and her father as a young child. So that, the trauma is actually quite explicit. There's nothing particularly shocking about how it's revealed. What is very disturbing and what she didn't expect was that going back into this creative space would create such a re-traumatization. So that's what the film is actually observing, and how she emerges from that. So, and in the course of that, we can also understand when people have been dealt with in a certain way, some of the uglier sides of that behavior might be transmitted into them. So, there's things that she's doing in the rehearsal room, which, as you point out, are clearly problematic. But it's interesting how the alarm bells don't sound in the way that they would if she were a male director, for sure. And that might be, because we're also understanding as we're watching the film why she's behaving that way. But it might just be the dynamics of that as well. But I'm glad you're bringing it out because I think it's part of the humor of the film, like dark humor, sardonic humor for sure. But like seeing her desperation to generate this erotic energy by any means possible is kind of outlandish, quite honestly, and extreme, but not unrealistic. I mean, I think when directors are desperate, they'll do almost anything to try and get the reaction they need, um, and the performances they need. I've been
And do
there.
you
I
think
mean, I not in this way, but I mean, like, when things are not working, and you just you need to find a way to make it work, right?
No, I completely understand that. And do you think some of that, like we said, the decision making she makes with the cast, the decision to show disdain towards the idea of an intimacy coordinator, do you think she ends up in the end fostering the same environment that she ended up getting taken advantage of in?
I think it's disturbing, but it's not unrealistic given what we understand of how trauma is transmitted. Like that, and and I think she's also, we have to understand, and it's sort of mentioned, like she hasn't been around, high level productions for a while. Like she's doing more like regional theater, trade shows, situations in which the issue of an intimacy coordinator may not even, come up, right? So it's now standard in these productions, thankfully. So like I completely agree that there should be intimacy coordinators because there's some real, like dark behavior out there, and it's great to have that like someone observing it and actually controlling that. So I have no issue with intimacy coordinators. However, I think her character, given her actual obsession with trying to get the same performance that she saw 20 years ago or 15 years ago, in a time when that was not the case, she's actually a little bit like Rip Van Winkle here. Like she's being introduced to this idea and trying to figure it out, and there are people like who take pride in saying that, oh, like I would never have an intimacy coordinator on my set. I'm not one of those people. I look back at some of my films, and which have very explicit erotic scenes, and I think they were done the right way, and I don't think any of the actors would ever feel that they were uncomfortable. But it would have been great to have had someone else observing that, just to be there. She's not schooled in that, so her reactions are quite honest to who she is and the experience she's had, but they're also, I think, wrong. I mean, I don't, and I think this is one of the things that makes this character so, she's pretty much on her own. There's no one on her side, and there are moments even as a viewer that we may really be like stranding her a little bit, right? But because Amanda's such a human presence and she's so identifiable that we want to believe her, and I think that's what makes those scenes so touching, is that we know they're wrong, but we also want to believe she's doing something that she feels is right, and that's a cool place to be because you're actually torn as a viewer, like it comes off as being humorous, uh, and as I say, kind of outlandish, but it's also real, I think.
And we do throughout the film, we do kind of get a view into her psyche and where she's at. And even though there was the affair, there does seem to be a lot of the unrequited love comparables between Janine and Charles and Salome and John the Baptist. Where do you think she views the relationship and Charles at the end of this film, everything that they had been through? Because you kind of get to watch her go through ebbs and flows throughout the film. Where do you think she lands when we're done with this production?
A great question. I think she says it pretty explicitly when she doesn't take the bow at the end, that ultimately she feels that the uh this idea of legacy, uh, that look, the whole institution of the Canadian Opera Company in the film, or the opera company, I mean, it's now run by the wife of Charles. I mean, and and that woman probably knew that he was having this affair. So one could make the argument that her observing the husband's wish, the deceased husband's wish to have her come back and remount it, was a way of her also kind of controlling this, being able to kind of set parameters, and so I think Janine understands that ultimately she's kind of a pawn in this other kind of machination, and that that production will always be associated with him, no matter what she does. However, as that's happening, she has directed something incredibly important for her. She's directed her mother's caregiver, who's also having an affair with her husband, to deface the painting of. Oh, I'm giving it away the plot. Okay, so I should. But I think she does something, in her own house, which is probably the strongest act of direction she gives in terms of coming to terms with who she is. So it's complicated, but I do think she understands that what happened with Charles was something that was really important to her and has left a huge mark on her, but it's not going to actually shift as a result of this, but something else in her life does. And it's tied to Charles ultimately because he was the person who invited her on to this production. And for all the I think vampiristic things that he might have done in terms of extracting, images from her and stories from her. I think maybe part of this idea was of her remounting it was to give that back to her, to give her agency, and it does give her agency, though not in the expected way, not in the institutionalized way, but it certainly in terms of her own personal journey through this material. Great questions. I mean,
Well,
these are foundational questions to the movie. I don't get to speak about them very often, but that I think is
well,
yeah.
I can't wait for people to see this film. I think there's so many parallels within it. There's so many interesting metaphors within it. It has been a pleasure talking with you today,
Okay.
Adam.
Yeah.
And like I said, I can't wait for people to discover this because I think it's a hidden gem of 2023 and will likely be a hidden gem of 2025 as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.